Ladies and gents, welcome to another episode of Hidden Perspective. This is Rob Greco. Good to be back. As always, if you're getting value out of these, please let some friends and family know about it. That would be much appreciated. I just want to congratulate everyone for, in the past 2 weeks, becoming a US citizen. It seems like the whole world has gone berserk into just reporting everything US related. I was chatting to family about it back home in Oz and, friends here in Canada. And, it just seems like everyone knows more about the electoral college system than they do about their own democracy in their own country. It's, I guess, a symptom of the US hegemony that we're living in. I do think Steve Bannon said it best a few years back when he said, politics has become the boom market of all boom markets in this past decade. It's gone absolutely berserk and has spilled over into everything. And one example of that is polling. It's just everywhere. No matter where you turn, no matter which news site, everyone is reporting on polling for the US 2020 election. Let's take a listen.
So here we are 6 days out. People are closely watching the polls. So we go to NBC News senior political editor Mark Murray for insight on those latest numbers. Thanks for the time as always, Mark. So the NBC national polling average right now has Vice President Joe Biden ahead.
But does anyone find this absolutely crazy? Wasn't it just the 2016 election when we realized that the polls are BS? They don't tell the truth. Let's take a listen.
What went wrong with the numbers, the predictions, that polls that suggested a late surge for Clinton? Eric Grenier is with me this morning, and I should just be very clear. Eric wasn't out in the field actually doing the numbers, but you've been our poll tracker, so you get to answer the questions that are going to be facing the industry today. How did polling get this so wrong, Eric?
And it wasn't just the 2016 US presidential election. A similar thing happened for Brexit. And a similar thing happened for the 2019 Australian federal election poll. Let's take a listen.
After losing more than 50 consecutive opinion polls, and maybe that's the last time we should mention them, but after 3 years of losses, the coalition won the only one that counts.
Okay, so let's dive into it. What exactly has gone wrong with polling in recent years? Well, the first one is just straight up unrepresentative sampling. That's something that all of us can intuitively understand. If you don't sample the right number of people, how are you possibly going to get the correct result? The first example of that is party bias. So this is a Forbes article titled "The Evidence is Clear, Polls Are Not to be Trusted." And in it, it says, on July 15th, headlines in the Wall Street Journal and NBC roared, "Trump trails Biden, Warren, and Sanders," citing a recent poll. But is this really the case? Upon further investigation, the poll is comprised of 42% Democrats, 36% Republicans, 12% Independent, and 10% other or not sure. A little bit later in the article, it goes on to cite a different poll, and it says that poll surveyed 46% of the people it surveyed were Democrats, 36% Republican, and 44% unemployed. But isn't this crazy that this was once accepted as a poll that reputable news sites, the Wall Street Journal and others, reported on? It's as crazy as if, you wanted to find out about meat eating habits in the US and 9 out of the 10 people you surveyed were vegetarians. And then you just conclude, only 10% of people eat meat now. It's just crazy that was once accepted. So it'll be interesting to see how much the polls have actually changed for the current election. Other reasons for incorrect polling, as the New York Times reported in its article, a 2016 review, why key state polls were wrong about Trump. It points to 3 factors, and it says at least 3 key types of errors have emerged as likely contributors to the pro-Clinton bias in pre-election surveys. Undecided voters broke for Trump in the final days of the race or in the voting booth. A turnout among Mr. Trump supporters was somewhat higher than expected, and state polls, in particular, understated Mr. Trump's support in the decisive Rust Belt region, in part because those surveys did not adjust for the educational composition of the electorate, a key to the 2016 race. So, undecided voters, I think that's somewhat forgivable. How do you really know where undecided voters will go come election day. Voter turnout, again, there were a lot of pro-Trump supporters that came out much higher than anticipated, and the educational component. So, those who are more likely to respond to surveys are more likely to have a college degree and thus more likely to vote Democrat. But if you weren't surveying enough people without a college degree and those people go out and vote for Trump, then obviously the pre-election polls are going to be inaccurate. So that's the New York Times article. And so the next component, which is kind of similar to the party bias, is responder bias. It's believed that the people who are actually more likely to respond to surveys are more likely to have higher civic engagement and therefore more likely to be voters. And it turns out that a lot of those people happen to be Clinton voters. But then, of course, when Trump voters who don't respond to surveys go out and vote higher than anticipated, that's going to skew the results even further. But another real problem with election polls is the methodology and the avenue through which you actually collect that polling data. So, typically we've done this through phone polls, and then in recent years we've switched a lot to online, although some people believe that phone polls are still much more reliable because you could potentially lie online. But this raises a couple of problems for phone polling, which is, one, who the hell has the time to sit down and sit through a 20-minute survey on the phone? There's a great Politico article which interviews two pollsters, Ari Kaptein and Robert Kahali, and these apparently these pollsters saw Trump winning in 2016. And in the article, it goes on to point out that people are busier than ever, and long questionnaires reduce the ability of average people to participate. Who has the time to answer 22 questions on a Tuesday night when you're trying to fix dinner or put your children to bed? Nobody. You end up with people on the ideological extremes, either very conservative or very liberal, or worse, people who are bored. And another component of this is it's actually much harder to conduct phone surveys now because it's difficult to find people's numbers. There's an ABC article titled Election 2019, How the Polls Got It So Wrong in Predicting a Labour Victory. So there's a quote from former Newspoll boss Martin O'Shaughnessy, who said, "The reason that it's hard to do good telephone polling is because the old white pages, the phone book, doesn't exist anymore," he said. One potential solution to this is for people to analyze social media trends. And this is something that a Australian researcher from Griffith University, Professor Bala Stantic, has done. And apparently he predicted Donald Trump's election to the US presidency in 2016 and also Brexit. And he just says, "I'm able to assess the opinions of people through their social media. Other polling has a much smaller sample." So that's one way that they could improve it. But some other ways that people have said that the polls are better this year than they were in 2016, which only time will tell, of course, is by people increasing the number of surveys and therefore the sample sizes that they're actually using for their polls. So there's a Washington Post article, which is how polling works and how it's changed since 2016. And in that article, it says, pollsters have made two significant changes this year. The first one is conducting more polls, as I just mentioned. So apparently Real Clear Politics tracked 105 polls in Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Arizona from the start of September to the end of October. But they only did 54 polls, so they've almost doubled it compared to the same period in the same areas in the 2016 election. And the second way they say they've improved polls is more polls also appear to be weighting samples by educational attainment, the article says. So, fixing that educational component that we touched on. But, there's a little hunch inside, that says even fixing these, representative, these sampling errors still won't make polls perfect. It's not going to make them 100% predictive. We can't still really trust polls. And there are, a few more explanations for why that is. The first is this hugely important concept, I think, for the economics profession and also for the polling profession, which is preference falsification. Now, this was coined by the economist Timur Kuran, and what it is, in his own words, from an episode from Eric Weinstein's The Portal. Let's take a listen.
So, preference falsification is the act of misrepresenting our wants under perceived social pressures. And it aims deliberately at disguising one's motivations and one's dispositions. It is very common, and sometimes it occurs in very innocent situations. If I go into somebody's home and they ask me, what do you think of the decor I've selected? I might actually, even though I don't like the decor, it doesn't suit my taste, I might say, oh, it's wonderful, and compliment my host's taste. I falsified my preference, but not much harm has come out of it. I've avoided hurting my host's feelings. But preference falsification happens in a very, very wide array of settings. And some of these settings, it leads to terrible consequences. In the political arena, people, whether they're on the left or whether they identify with the right or somewhere in between, people routinely falsify their political preferences for fear that they will be skewered if they express exactly what's on their mind, if they say exactly what they want, if they express the ideas, that lie under those preferences.
Intuitively, this makes sense, right? I think we've all done this several times in our life. An example of mine is, when you tell someone that you're extremely excited to go to their party when in fact you're not, and the only reason you do it is to risk not offending them. I think we all have examples where we say one thing or what we really want when in fact that's a lie. This concept, preference falsification, in part explains the silent majority, where people are giving misleading responses to pollsters out of fear of social ostracization. And there is an argument that this has only been made worse by cancel culture, where there's a negative association coming out publicly and supporting someone like Trump as opposed to Clinton or Biden this year. And, there are anecdotes that people have blatantly just been fired for coming out in support of Trump. There's a Hill article titled State of the Race, Cancel Culture and Polling Don't Mix. And the author gives a few examples. So Justin Kuchera, who was a teacher and baseball coach at a Michigan high school, who tweeted the fact that @real Donald Trump is our president. Then district administrators offered him a choice: leave on your own terms or ours. There's another example of a dental assistant named Robin Pollack, who was a single mother in Wisconsin. She posted her support for the president one day, and then soon after that, she was fired. Another example of a nurse named Lizzie Matthews. She honestly answered one of her patients' questions about who she voted for in the 2016, and then next minute, before she knew it, she was fired. So, there is some anecdotal evidence that people are going to be reluctant to publicize their support for a controversial political figure like President Trump. And I guess the way you'd prove it, right, is you'd compare levels of self-censorship over time versus levels of polling margin errors over time and see if there's a correlation. I haven't seen a perfect study that's done that, but, if we look at this article here, the polls are all right from 538, which is the, prediction polling website. And, the average margin error in polls for the 2016 general election, when I guess self-censorship was potentially higher than 4 years ago, was 4.8, whereas in 2012, the average margin error was only 3.6. So that would seem to validate that assumption. But again, don't look at me for a perfectly scientific paper here. I don't have all the figures. But this is something that intuitively I think a lot of pollsters feel, is that there is this sense of preference falsification. People are going to be reluctant to pronounce their support for Trump. There is this Politico article, again, the one I was referring to, and those pollsters have, said, we live in a country where people will lie to their accountant, they'll lie to their doctor, they'll lie to their priest, and we're supposed to believe they shed all of that when they get on the telephone with a stranger. One way that these guys have actually tried to overcome this problem is by asking a social circle question, which is, instead of asking, will you vote for Trump or Biden, they say, who do you think your friends and neighbors will vote for? And the idea behind this is that you're more likely to tell the truth when it's done under the guise of someone else. It's the classic, I'm just asking for a friend, when in fact you don't want to disguise what that your question is in fact for you. When they ask the normal question, they get a 10-point lead nationally for Biden over Trump. But when they ask the social circle question, it's a lot. That lead reduces. Biden only gets a 5 or 6 point lead in comparison to the 10-point lead. So that's one way to overcome it. But there are still some other issues why you wouldn't really trust polls. There's a conspiracy going around that Republicans are deliberately lying to pollsters. There is this pro-Trump idea that all the experts are wrong, this anti-expert sentiment, and it seems that some Republicans would be playing into it by deliberately lying to pollsters, saying that they'd support Biden instead of Trump. So this is something that Scott Adams, creator of Dilbert, has been propagating along with some other users on Twitter. Let's take a listen to Scott Adams on this point.
But I'm going to stick with my prediction that the polls are inaccurate and people are lying to those pollsters because it's funny. It's funny. I asked on Twitter, a little Twitter poll, have any of you actually lied to the pollsters about your support for Trump? Hundreds of people said yes. And they weren't saying we might lie or we think we'll do it in the future. They said we have this year.
Again, we don't know if this is true, but it would be hilarious if it's a conspiracy that gets validated come election night. What about the fact that, polls were never designed to be perfect? I think this is something that really changed my way of thinking when I read it. Which is that, the media tends to project, at least before 2016, that polls have predictive powers. But a lot of these media outlets or pundits who are talking about it fail to tell you that even the statisticians realize that there are statistical margins of errors which needs to be taken into account. So, Nate Silver, who is, founder of 538, statistician, big dog in the polling market, has basically called BS on the idea that polls have declined in quality over recent years. And he says they're as accurate or as inaccurate as they've always been. He says, the media narrative that polling accuracy has taken a nosedive is mostly bullshit. In other words, polls are never as good as the media assumed they were before 2016, and they aren't nearly as bad as the media seems to assume they are now. In reality, not that much has changed. One way we can conceptualize this is, if we look at the average margin of polling error over since 1998 to 2018 in the US, covering all elections from primary, general, governor, US state Senate, and the US House, the average polling error is 5.9. So if you round this to 6, he says, if the average error is 6 points, that means the true empirically derived margin of error, or 95% confidence interval, is closer to 14 or 15 percentage points. That's much more than you'd infer from the margins of error that pollsters traditionally list, which consider only sampling error and not other potential sources of error, which pertain only to one candidate's vote share and not the margin between candidates. This means that you shouldn't be surprised when a candidate who had been trailing in the polls by only a few points wins a race. And in some cases, even a poll showing a 10 or 12 or 14-point lead isn't enough to make a candidate's lead safe. So basically, what all this means is, given the statistical uncertainty with polls, you can never say that an 8-point lead means with 100% confidence that Biden will win over 8 points over Trump. There's always this statistical uncertainty due to things like sampling errors and other sources of uncertainty, which invalidate the confidence that you would otherwise see media project onto those polls. So in other words, it's not like the polls were ever meant to be predictive. It's only that just the media ran with the narrative that they were predictive because, I don't know, makes for better news if you can say with certainty what the polls are going to say, and you can instill a sense of certainty as to what's going to happen in your viewers or readers. To me, it reminds me of that example of GDP. So, GDP was, the economic concept that measures a country's national income. It was pioneered by the economist Simon Kuznets back in the 1930s, but he never really thought that the GDP was a perfect measure of human well-being. He actually actively made a point of saying that it was imperfect and we shouldn't solely be relying on GDP to measure human well-being. But then obviously it became a different creature. It took a course of its own, GDP, and everyone started using it as this invincible, this extremely accurate measure, when in fact it was never intended to be that measure by the person who designed it. And so I think the same thing has been happening with polling, where it was never meant to be a perfectly predictive tool, but the people who have gone on to use it and communicate on it in the media are acting as if it's something that it's not. So on that note, that's where I'm going to end today's episode. As always, thanks for listening.
I think they're all insane.
And one final thing, if you enjoyed this episode, please spread the word and let your friends and family know about it. And also, if you haven't already, make sure you hit subscribe. And if you're watching on YouTube, hit the like button and notification bell. See you next time.